The VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is protection of civilians in armed conflict. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following individuals to participate in the meeting. Mr. Peter Mauro, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Her Excellency Ms. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, former President of Liberia. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of the Council members to document S/2020/366, the report of the Secretary General on protection of civilians in armed conflict. I wish to also draw the attention of Council members to document S/2020/402, a letter dated 14th of May 2020, from the Permanent Representative of Estonia to the United Nations addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept note on the item under consideration. I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary General, the distinguished Deputy Prime Minister, ministers, and other high-level representatives. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank the Government of Estonia for convening this debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Protecting civilians must be a joint effort by governments, civil society, and international organizations, and I look forward to hearing the views of Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Mr. Peter Maurer, the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross. As we meet today, the COVID-19 pandemic rages on, causing enormous human suffering and additional stress to health systems, economies, and communities. Those that are already weakened by years of armed conflict are particularly vulnerable. COVID-19 is not only spreading sickness and death, it is pushing people into poverty and hunger. In some cases, it is reversing decades of development progress. As access to services and safety is curtailed, and as some leaders exploit the pandemic to adopt repressive measures, it has become even more difficult to protect the most vulnerable. This is particularly true in conflict zones where civilians were already exposed to significant risks. COVID-19 poses a major threat to refugees and internally displaced people crowded together in camps and to communities that lack sanitation and healthcare facilities. Cases in a refugee camp in Bangladesh and among displaced people in the protection of civilian site in South Sudan underline the importance of including displaced people in preparedness and prevention efforts. My call for a global ceasefire in March was aimed at ending the fighting so that we can focus on ending the pandemic. A global ceasefire would create conditions for a stronger response to the pandemic and the delivery of humanitarian aid to the most vulnerable people, and would open space for dialogue. I am encouraged by expressions of support. However, this support has not been translated into concrete action. In some cases, the pandemic may even create incentives for warring parties to press their advantage or to strike hard while international attention is focused elsewhere. Both scenarios could lead to increase in violence, and civilians always pay the price. The United Nations mission in Libya documented at least 58 civilians killed and 190 injured between 1 April and 18 May. United Nations peacekeeping operations are one of the most effective means of protecting civilians in conflict zones around the world. Our Blue Helmets are now supporting national authorities in their response to the pandemic by protecting healthcare and humanitarian workers and facilitating access to aid and prevention. I saw for myself last year our mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, MONUSCO, made an important contribution to the successful efforts against the Ebola outbreak in the east of the country. Today, our peacekeeping mission in the Central African Republic, MINUSCA, is working closely with the authorities and security services to find new ways to serve the population while protecting themselves. MINUSCA police are helping to increase the capacity of the internal security forces to curb the spread of the virus while staying safe. In Mali, MINUSMA is fully engaged to suppress transmission of COVID-19 and control the spread, while continuing to perform its vital roles of protecting civilians and supporting implementation of the peace agreement. Mr. President, where armed conflicts continue, COVID-19 makes the protection of civilians more challenging than ever and our support more important than ever. It's only through respect for human rights and international humanitarian and refugee law that we can protect civilians, including health and humanitarian workers and infrastructure, and relieve pressure on health systems. But the prospects are bleak. My latest report on the protection of civilians in the armed conflict shows little progress on the protection of civilians and on compliance with international law in 2019. More than 20,000 civilians were killed or injured in just 10 conflicts: Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Iraq, Libya, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen. This figure, which only includes incidents verified by the UN, is just a fraction of the total. Last year, for the 9th year running, 90% of people killed by explosive weapons in populated areas were civilians. I urge all governments to make a strong commitment to avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. Tens of thousands of children were forced to take part in hostilities in 2019. Millions of people are displaced as a result of armed conflict. At the end of 2019, the International Committee of the Red Cross was handling some 140,000 requests from families of missing people. I commend the Council's adoption of the first ever resolution on people missing in conflict last year and welcome all efforts to shed light on this tragedy and trigger action. Women and girls in places affected by conflict were subjected to appalling levels of sexual and gender-based violence. They also suffered targeted attacks, intimidation, abduction, forced marriage, and restriction of movement based on their sex. People with disabilities are disproportionately impacted and experience even higher levels of risks in war zones. Conflict also remains the main driver of global hunger. There are some 135 million acutely food insecure people in the world. More than half live in countries and territories affected by conflict. We expect COVID-19 to cause a sharp increase in this number. Throughout the year, humanitarian access was hampered by violence, insecurity, and bureaucratic impediments, often in violation of international humanitarian law. Violence against humanitarian workers and assets was widely reported. In Afghanistan, 32 aid workers were killed, 52 injured, and 532 abducted. In Yemen, there were nearly 400 incidents of violence against humanitarian personnel and assets. National staff accounted for more than 90% of those killed and injured. According to the World Health Organization, 199 healthcare workers were killed in more than 1,000 attacks in 2019, a shocking increase from an already inexcusable 794 in 2018. This month's attack on a maternity hospital in Kabul, in the middle of a major global health crisis, makes it even more essential for member states to take urgent measures to implement Security Council resolution and protect the provision of medical care in conflict. Mr. President, last year marked 20 years since the Security Council added the protection of civilians to the agenda and the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. The year brought several important initiatives and commitments, including the call to action to bolster respect for international humanitarian law endorsed by 40 states. Such pledges are an important first step. However, compliance and accountability are essential and lacking. I repeat my call to states to develop national frameworks to strengthen the protection of civilians in armed conflict. States must also ensure accountability through strengthened efforts to prevent serious violations of international law by prioritizing investigation and prosecution. I urge all to move beyond the rhetoric and close the accountability gap through national legislation and coordinated international action. My report outlines other actions that require greater global attention. First, I urge states to review and rethink their approach to urban warfare, committing to the protection of civilians in their doctrine, strategy, and tactics. This includes measures to condition arms exports on respect for international humanitarian and human rights law. Second, armed drones are increasingly being used to conduct attacks in many situations of armed conflict, including Libya and Yemen. We need to reassert the authority of international law over their use. Third, we must address the legal, moral, and ethical implications posed by the development of lethal autonomous weapon systems. It is my deep conviction that machines with the power and discretion to take lives without human involvement must be prohibited by international law. Finally, we must tackle the malicious use of digital technology to conduct cyber attacks on critical civilian infrastructure. Reports from several countries indicate a rise in cyber attacks on healthcare facilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. We must do more to prevent and end these new forms of aggression, which can cause further severe harm to civilians. Mr. President, civilians caught up in violence now face a new and deadly threat from COVID-19. The pandemic is amplifying and exploiting the fragilities of our world. Conflict is one of the greatest causes of that fragility. Protecting civilians requires us to do much more to ensure compliance with international law and accountability for violations. We must also do more to prevent, reduce, and resolve conflicts. Sustainable political solutions remain the only way to ensure that civilians are kept safe from harm, and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. We understand he has to leave at 11 a.m. due to another engagement, but I would like to thank him again for his participation in today's meeting. I now give the floor to Mr. Peter Maurer.
President, Secretary General, esteemed colleagues. Secretary General Guterres' report card on the state of protection highlights the enormous violations and the failures to protect men, women, and children around the globe. Communities caught in the crossfire of armed conflict suffer shock after shock, violation after violation, until their resilience is threadbare. I am concerned for people, for the rising numbers of people displaced, stuck in limbo without any prospect of lasting solutions to their plight, for the millions of families searching endlessly for their missing loved ones, for the urban poor, elderly, people detained, migrants, refugees, women, survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, people with disability. I'm concerned for broken places and systems, the migration and displacement camps, and the prisons where human dignity is as absent as clean water and sanitation. I'm concerned for emerging threats, the rapid spread of hate speech, stigmatization of all kinds, data misused to suppress or control populations instead of protecting them. I'm concerned for the shrinking space for neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian work. And I'm concerned for the behaviors of belligerents and all who support them, for the violations of human life and dignity caused by persistent disregard or expedient interpretation of international humanitarian law and other international legal frameworks. In particular, I raise the devastating impacts for civilians when explosive weapons with a wide impact area are used in populated areas. The death and destruction left behind by heavy explosive weapons raises serious questions about international humanitarian law compliance and signals the urgent need for a change of behavior to protect civilians, including by avoiding the use of such weapons in populated areas. A strong, unequivocal political declaration committing states to take concrete action in this direction would be a good first step. The ICRC is working on policy and operational level recommendations to this end. Dear colleagues, the divisions in the Council on critical concept of humanitarian law and work, notably access to population in need, are increasing the suffering on the front lines. While the ICRC takes responsibility to deliver neutral and impartial humanitarian services independently and within the legal framework of the Geneva Conventions, it is your responsibility to facilitate access to populations in need. You are obliged to proactively facilitate access and not to pile mountains of bureaucratic and political obstacles on humanitarian organizations. You are not asked to tell humanitarian organization who is in need, but rather to allow neutral and impartial organizations to do independent needs assessments in full transparency. And if there are divisions on whether people in a specific context are in need or not, I would expect states to allow humanitarians to do their jobs as a default precautionary measure unless imperative security reasons prohibit. International humanitarian law principles and concepts have been developed to protect people, not to make a point towards your political adversaries. I urge you to base your policies in this regard on the law, which is the only reasonable basis for consensus, and to leave political controversies outside of humanitarian concerns. Dear colleagues, the COVID-19 crisis is fast threatening to become a protection crisis. At a time when they are most needed, helpers are under attack. Health systems are targeted. Health workers are abused. Since March this year, the ICRC has recorded 208 COVID-19 related attacks against healthcare in 13 countries in which we operate. The socio-economic impacts will cause new waves of despair, leaving people facing hunger and poverty exposed to abuse and exploitation. States' response to the pandemic shows the risk that without checks and balances, emergency health measures can become abusive tools to control a population's movement or withhold services. We fear that some groups, perhaps those considered the enemy, may be excluded from life-saving measures. For example, any vaccine distribution in volatile and contested places will be difficult, but it must be available to all equitably. On a more positive note, states have also stepped up in response to the pandemic, implementing more humane policies. If I have optimism during this bleak crisis, it is because I see the potential for actors to take measures during this crisis which spark a recommitment in support of humanitarian protection. For example, we have seen the safe releases from detention of many people deprived of liberty, the decisions to regularize non-documented migrants to ensure they can access healthcare, and the adoption of unilateral ceasefires. Arms bearers remain engaged with ICRC during the crisis, with new opportunities for dialogue and advice arising. As police forces and military personnel are called on to maintain public order, the ICRC has maintained a dialogue with public forces to ensure that international law is upheld when conducting operations. And as part of our broader dialogue with hundreds of non-state armed groups across the world, the ICRC is engaged with Islamist and Salafi scholars in the Sahel on a fatwa on COVID-19, giving guidance on the respect of the deceased and on health protocols. I'm also encouraged by the potential for multi-stakeholder responses to influence behaviors. This week, 40 global leaders joined the ICRC's call on governments to work together to stop cyber attacks on the healthcare sector. Excellencies, it cannot be overstated. The extreme vulnerability of people in conflict zones to repeated shocks is in large part the result of a disregard of states and other belligerents' legal obligations towards population under their control over many years. Respecting and ensuring respect for IHL in all circumstances would protect people from the impact of war, but also shield against the subsequent shock waves, whether health, economic, or environmental. We call on you to ensure that in all situations, whether enforcing exceptional measures in response to the public health emergencies, during the conduct of hostilities, or in situations of public unrest, that your response are guided by the utmost respect for the protection of civilians. We also call you to respect the dignity and rights of persons deprived of liberty, the deceased and the families of the missing. We ask that you are stronger in word and deed, in upholding international humanitarian law, improving behaviors on the battlefields, and ensuring that human life and dignity is protected without exception. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mauro, for your briefing, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf. Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Excellencies and distinguished members of the Council, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for this opportunity in which to make a few points I believe relevant to our purpose. The first is to congratulate you, Madam President, on your country's presidency of the Security Council and for your leadership of this high-level open debate on the prevention of conflict of civilians in armed conflicts. I also extend greetings to the Secretary General and the entire family of the United Nations as we mark the 75th year of the formation of this preeminent multilateral body, the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action, as well as the 20th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. These milestones offer a chance to reflect. My hope is that the reflections will further pave the way for increased women's leadership and strengthen our efforts to protect traditionally marginalized and vulnerable groups, which are often women, children, and persons with disabilities trapped by conflicts. Unerringly, some of these conflicts are so protracted. Not only have we seen multiple changes in actors, but also many have been born and have died without experiencing what it is to be a child or to be an adult with achieved aspirations and rights. Instead, their lives have been defined, often shortened and narrowed by conflicts they have had no part in creating. It is time to act with boldness, because unless we do so now, we will lose many more lives, many others will have life-changing injuries, and millions more will be forcibly displaced. We must find a way to end this cycle of immeasurable loss and human tragedy. The truth also is that unless we end these ongoing conflicts, any semblance of a just compact between these states and their peoples, any possibility of addressing the inequities and injustices which have often fueled the conflicts as prerequisites for developmental transformation cannot be met, and even worse, may be lost for more generations to come. This too is why I could not agree more with the Secretary General that the most effective way to protect civilians is to prevent the outbreak, escalation, continuation, and recurrence of armed conflicts. That brings to me the second point. A conflict averted often does not make headlines, but it saves lives and livelihoods. And in this regard, nothing could weigh more on our collective consciences are on the desk of this council, then the urgent need to stop ongoing conflicts and preventing new ones. I know that preventing a conflict is never easy, and yet our collective experience shows that it is less costly, if not easier, than ending them. Consequently, where peacekeeping mandates now need to be changed, we must change them. Where missions need to be reassessed, we must reassess them. Where this council needs to be broadened and strengthened to reflect the changing reality of our world, we must adopt and reform. Where individual members are holding the council back by narrow self-interest and the unattended use of the veto power, we must find a worldwide formula to preserve the collective interests. What we simply cannot do is resign ourselves to a sense of hopelessness in settling for and accepting the continuation of many of these prolonged carnages. After all, the United Nations and its many organs, especially the Security Council, represent hope for peace. 75 years ago, our nations acted with courage to end a global war. This council now represents the hope and aspirations of our global community for international peace and security. We must find the political will and commitment, long absent, and you, must act now. Today, our world is beset with increasing conflicts, growing threats of violent extremism, and a young population which is increasingly less hopeful about living in peace. We simply cannot continue this way. It is time to change. I understand that the United Nations alone cannot end all conflicts. It requires a multitude of actors and commitments, including the involvement of women through the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325, which remains a key ingredient for peace. But I also know that the role of the Security Council is pivotal, especially a council which is more representative of all the peoples of the world, so as to be more effective in ending and preventing conflicts. A Liberian, I'm grateful to the Security Council and the larger United Nations for supporting the interventions which helped broker and bring peace to my country. However, in my country, like in many places of ongoing conflicts, the fault lines and signs were visible for many years. Simply put, protecting human rights, ending impunity, and the use of preventive diplomacy are crucial to stopping conflicts before they rage into full conflagrations. We must not ignore the many signals today and delay actions that are required to prevent conflict. Finally, Madam President, Excellencies and distinguished members of the Council, the COVID-19 pandemic with more than 5 million infected and over 300,000 deaths worldwide is a painful human tragedy. I extend deepest condolences to all who are grieving for loved ones and pray speedy recovery for the infected. And yet, even in this period of sadness, we are reminded of many important lessons which we must use to prevent conflicts and war. The first is that women's leadership or their participation in gender equal governance has often made the difference in this fight. Secondly, the virus is a pandemic. Without regional and global solidarity, the whole world would be more deeply and tragically affected. From global health and human development to peace and climate change, we need more multilateralism and not less. Only by working together can we find the cures for our common challenges and make the world safer, better, and more peaceful. Thirdly, leaving impoverished nations out of ongoing medical research and hopefully The development of needed cures will not mean that wealthier nations can continue to live in a protected bubble. Fourthly, we face an urgent need to reset the world to higher standards of international cooperation and peace as the most enduring and sustainable path to successfully confronting our common challenges, as well as ending ongoing conflicts and preventing future ones. This pandemic has humbled all of us, and it has given us our greatest test in living memory. The truth also is that it is not beyond you to pass this test. However, to pass this test will redefine the course of human history. Let us not fail ourselves in posterity. I do not know how many will be infected or how many lives will be lost, or where growth projections and human development indices will be before this pandemic ends. But I do know, as if we needed further proof, that we are more connected and interdependent than we have allowed ourselves to believe and have committed ourselves to act together. I know, like others have said, that the world and our lives as we know it will change. It is now upon us, upon you, to ensure that changes are for the better, for the good of humanity. Indeed, we face a test for lifetime. May you find the courage, as it was in 1945, to also answer for a lifetime. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Excellency. And I now have the honor to welcome Her Excellency, President Kersti Kaljulaid, who will make a statement on behalf of the Republic of Estonia.
Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear Chair, first of all, thank you for the comprehensive and insightful briefings. Mine starts with a confession. I feel helpless and also responsible, that I am not able to do more to put things right. Sitting on the safe side of the conflict line in Ukraine, talking to some of the 1.4 million who have fled the war in Ukraine, Europe, in the 21st century, but some 3.5 million have been left behind in dire need of humanitarian assistance and protection. Or visiting a shelter of the United Nations Migration Organization, trying to comprehend the suffering of the miners gathered there. Some bearing the wounds life should have never inflicted on these young ones. I feel inadequate. All the things I brought them feel inadequate too. All of us, the leaders, collectively, feel so inadequate when I look into these young eyes, full of acceptance of their fate, which I cannot fully comprehend. Time stands still at a point in their timeline where the past is suffering and the future is simply insecure. Estonia has put the principles of international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, at the center of our work here in the Security Council. The Secretary General's annual report indicates that the normative framework for the protection of civilians is not working in real life. We are indeed inadequate in implementing what we have agreed already. The pandemic adds a new layer of risks, which we must be able to mitigate. Estonia supports the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire during the COVID pandemic. The Security Council must really do something about it, making sure at least state actors heed the call. I am particularly concerned about the most vulnerable, women, children, and adolescents. In Africa, midwives are presented with daily fears of becoming infected with various diseases, not just COVID-19, while attending to mothers. Patricia Mwenieri, a midwife in Malawi, only has access to one hand-washing basin in her maternity ward. Is this adequate? 2 weeks ago, a 4-year-old girl was raped in Mogadishu. Is this gruesome sexual violence acceptable? Tomorrow, a virtual Every Woman, Every Child high-level roundtable will discuss what can we do specifically in these trying times, when the only positive is that the health threats people constantly face in less developed parts of the world ravaged by conflict are much more palpable for all of us because of COVID. Estonia has contributed to the United Nations Global Humanitarian Response Plan and the International Red Cross appeals. Ladies and gentlemen, in Libya, 221 schools are non-functional. Unlawful attacks against schools, universities, students and teachers are frequent in conflicts around the globe. In February, journalists Abdel Nasser Haj Hamdan and Amjad Akhtalati were killed in an airstrike on Idlib, while they were providing us primary source information from the conflict in Syria. We must protect civil society organizations and human rights defenders who are our partners, who are practically delivering, risking their lives. The war has an ever-changing face, urbanization of conflict, climate change, but they all confirm the significance of the fundamental framework of international law. New technologies can improve humanitarian assistance. Artificial intelligence is already reuniting lost family members separated by conflict, as people testify on the Red Cross Trace the Face website. At the same time, we have seen cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure, including healthcare. Therefore, existing international law needs to apply also in cyberspace, and cybersecurity has to be part of both conflict prevention and resolution. Estonia promised to bring cybersecurity to the Security Council, and I believe we have delivered. Ladies and gentlemen, there are a number of tools for the Council to enhance compliance with international law and to ensure accountability. Investigative and judicial mechanisms, mandating peacekeeping missions, targeting sanctions. These tools need to be applied consistently across conflict situations. When it comes to sanctions, we observe with concern how the global pandemic is used as a pretext to call for their termination. Sanctions are built so as not to hinder humanitarian aid. There are other developments which do. Estonia calls for unimpeded humanitarian access in Syria. All arguments not to extend the cross-border mechanism in July don't correspond with the reality on the ground. We must value accountability. Member states have to cooperate fully with the International Criminal Court. UN monitoring missions of the conflicts also raise valuable awareness of the perpetrators and their actions on the ground. The Secretary General has repeatedly pointed to the key element of political will in moving from normative commitments to actual improvement in the protection of civilians. It is sometimes hard to comprehend how blatantly lacking this will can be. I see every time that girl with one hand trying to care for a little sister, an image of poor, innocent suffering. Each and every time when I hear we could not agree on the wording here in Security Council. We are powerful, together, aided by international law and good people globally, if only we want to be. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Madam President. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Sir Louis Starker, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Trade and Commerce of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, Secretary General, distinguished members of the Security Council of the United Nations. I wish to thank Her Excellency Kersti Kaljulaid, President of the Republic of Estonia, for her opening statement. I also welcome the insightful briefings from His Excellency Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Nobel Peace Laureate and member of the Elders, and Mr. Peter Moore, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Mr. President, protecting civilians from the harsh realities and consequences of armed conflict is a central priority of our international system. Yet, as conflicts become more complex and dynamic in nature, our efforts to protect civilians are increasingly tethered to the multidimensional threat landscape. The scale of attacks against civilian and civilian infrastructure remains unacceptably high, particularly in densely populated settings, where urban warfare is a defining feature of armed conflict. High numbers of civilian fatalities and injuries, forced displacements, conflict-related sexual violence against primarily women and girls, but also men and boys, and grave violations against children, including abduction, forced labor, and recruitment to armed groups, are also equally appalling. The situation for civilians is exacerbated by the denial of humanitarian access, attacks against peacekeepers or civilian society working to alleviate the impact of conflict, as well as deepening social and economic inequality in many conflict-afflicted states. COVID-19 continues to amplify an already dire situation for civilians, especially those in IDP camps, with compromised access to healthcare, proper nutrition, and sanitation. With lockdown measures impeding humanitarian service delivery and heightening exposure to sexual and gender-based violence, St. Vincent and the Grenadines emphasizes that COVID-19 mitigation strategies must center on the diverse socioeconomic needs of civilians in conflict-affected areas. The urgent and ever-growing challenges of the climate crisis further compound the protection of civilians' agenda. We are all aware of the increasing accounts of extreme weather phenomena, including erratic precipitation, flooding, prolonged heat waves, and desertification affecting countries from the Sahel to the Greater Horn of Africa. This is further compounded by the expanding desert locust infestation. These challenges lead to increased vulnerability, intensify food insecurity, and forcibly displace many at-risk populations in situations of conflict. The complications of climate, conflict, and COVID must be systematically and simultaneously addressed to ensure durable security and development outcomes for all civilians in these regions and beyond. Efforts to safeguard the lives and livelihoods of civilians must adhere to the principles enshrined in international law, that's international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international refugee law. St. Vincent and the Grenadines strongly condemns the ongoing and flagrant violation of this body of international law established to secure the dignity and well-being of all persons. We recall all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions that embed the protection of civilians' agenda in our efforts to prevent the outbreak, escalation, continuance, and recurrence of armed conflict. We also emphasize that human dignity must remain the cornerstone of any credible attempt to promote lasting peace and security. Mr. President, as we contemplate the calls for greater specificity in the protection of civilians agenda to reflect the diverse groups and individuals affected by armed conflict versus the supposed threat of fragmentation of this agenda, let us not renege on our collective responsibility to all of humanity. The exigencies of our time demand precision, care, specificity, prudence, and inclusivity to achieve the transformation envisaged by those civilians on whose behalf we serve. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Retno Marsudi, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. Minister, you have the floor.
Mr. President, thank you for organizing this important meeting. I also thank the Secretary General and the briefers for their insight. Colleagues, last year, I presided over the open debate commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Protection of Civilian Agenda and the 70th anniversaries of the Geneva Convention. Indonesian message then remains relevant during this COVID-19 pandemic. The Council must continue exercising its moral weight to protect civilians in armed conflict. Indeed, the pandemic does not stop conflict from happening in many parts of the world. Violent attacks increased by 37% between mid-March and mid-April in sub-Saharan Africa. Armed conflict also displaced at least 661,000 people over the past 2 months. COVID-19 gives extra burden to the people in conflict-affected countries and complicates our effort to protect civilians. Mr. President, against this backdrop, I have 3 key messages. First, it is important to provide humanitarian power. This pandemic is a momentum to put the brake on the fightings. Laying down weapons will ensure unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance, create a space for credible peace process, and allow us to focus on fighting COVID-19. For this reason, Indonesia reiterates the Secretary General's appeal for immediate global ceasefire in all conflict situations, including in Afghanistan. Together with Norway, Germany, Qatar, and Uzbekistan, Indonesia launched a joint statement to ceasefire in Afghanistan, to support ceasefire in Afghanistan. Global ceasefire requires political will, putting aside animosity and the unity of the Council. Second point, it is very critical to ensure compliance with international humanitarian law at any time. All parties to conflict must honor their obligation. Civilians are not target. The greater protection must be given for those who are already in their situation: women, children, refugees, and displaced persons. Continued attack on healthcare facilities in conflict-affected countries, impairing further their already fragile capacity to fight COVID-19. And this has to stop. Palestine is one of the textbook examples where compliance to international humanitarian law is desperately needed now.
You are the only participant.
Continuous imminent annexation and the COVID-19 pandemic has struck Palestine at once. The world and this council is indebted to restore the Palestinian right over its territory in line with 1967 border. Now, we must not let further annexation happen on various standpoints, since it will threaten regional stability and security, it will undermine a two-state solution, and it will throw away all international consensus and parameters on the issue of Palestine, and it will shift the world focus away from fighting against COVID-19 pandemic. My third point, it is also crucial to place women empowerment at the heart of the protection of civilians. Indonesia is a strong proponent of community engagement in protecting civilians. Local communities, particularly women, must become part and parcel of the development and implementation of protection of civilian strategy. As agents of protection of civilians, women have greater access to communities. They are essential enablers to build trust and confidence, and women help prevent and reduce conflict and confrontation. Inclusive participation of women would also benefit any peace process, as they have unique perspective to offer. Empowering women means empowering the whole nation. This is evident when I led Indonesia female leaders to have a dialogue with Afghan women in Kabul last February to encourage their greater contribution in peace process. Indonesia-Afghan Women Solidarity Network was launched during my visit to Afghanistan. Later this year, Indonesia aimed to establish Southeast Asian Network of women peace negotiators and mediators. Indonesia is also committed to increasing the number of female peacekeepers, contributing to gender parity amongst the Blue Helmet. There are 154 Indonesian female peacekeepers on the ground now, all of which will contribute to the implementation of community engagement and protection of civilian mandate on the mission. Mr. President, COVID-19 is unlike any global crisis in the 75 years history of the UN. However, during this dark moment of our time, we cannot neglect the imperative to protect civilians in armed conflicts. After all, the United Nations was established to save succeeding generation from the source of war, and protecting civilians is one of the most important tasks to prevent us from failing. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Madam Minister. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Noureddin Erre, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Tunisia. Mr. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, thank you for convening this high-level open meeting on such highly important topic as the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Let me take this opportunity to congratulate Estonia on a successful presidency of the Security Council this month, despite the difficult work conditions imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. I would like also to thank the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his comprehensive briefing and report, and commend his leadership and tireless effort to uphold the protection of civilians, especially in this particularly difficult COVID-19 context, which severely impact populations already afflicted by conflicts, including refugees, displaced people, as well as those living under occupation. My thanks and appreciation go also to Mr. Peter Maurer for the long-standing commitment and action of the ICRC related to the protection of civilians in armed conflicts and other situations of violence for more than a century. I salute the participation of this meeting of the Nobel Peace, Mrs. Laureate N. Johnson Sirleaf, a leading actor in promotion of peace, justice, and democratic rule. Mr. President, it's important on such occasion to recall that the protection of the civilian population is a basic element of humanitarian law. Civilians not taking part in hostilities must, on no account, be attacked and should be spared and protected. The 1949 Geneva Convention and their 1977 additional protocols, as well as other instruments of international law, mainly human rights law, contain specific rules to protect civilians. Unfortunately, despite this adequate and comprehensive legal framework, today's reality shows that the civilian population continues to suffer most from the consequences of armed violence. In these various ongoing conflicts, whether in Africa, in the Middle East, or elsewhere, civilians are increasingly caught up in hostilities, including in urban populated areas. Even worse, in many instances, we witness military operations by armed groups deliberately targeting civilians as retaliation for perceived support to their adversary. It's deplorable to acknowledge that conflicts continue to have devastating impact on women and children, as tens of thousands of boys and girls are being forced to take part in hostilities, including on front lines, and are being exposed to a multitude of other violations, including killing, maiming, and sexual violence. The protection of civilians may even deteriorate under the COVID-19, a context which might be seen by some parties to conflicts as an opportunity to strike as governments and international community are observed by health crisis. Such a scenario could lead to increased violence and civilian suffering. Mr. President, we have to admit that more than 70 years after the adoption of the Geneva Conventions and more than 20 years after the Security Council added the protection of civilians to its agenda, the results are way below expectation. The truth is that the terrible suffering which continues to be inflicted upon civilians caught up in armed conflicts is due not to inadequate legal framework, but to the poor complaints by actors and to the absence of accountability of serious violence. Such a suffering will be highly diminished if parties to the conflicts respected international humanitarian and international human rights law, or if perpetrators of serious violence are held accountable. As a party of Rome Statute, Tunisia is strongly committed to the fight against impunity and reiterates its full support to the ICC to investigate, prosecute, and try individuals accused of committing the most serious crimes of concern to the international community. We believe it's urgent to initiate a debate around the growing accusation and use of armed drones to address concerns, not only over compliance with IHL and accountability, but also over its use by non-state actors in terrorist activities. Mr. President, beyond calling for promoting respect of IHL and accountability, the protection of civilians requires that we strive to put an end to the hostility and silence the guns everywhere. In this regard, we reiterate our full support to the call launched on 23 March by the Secretary General for the global ceasefire. We believe that the Security Council has a moral obligation to support this call, particularly in the COVID-19 pandemic context, and we look forward to unanimous adoption of the draft resolution presented by Tunisia and France in this regard, taking into account, among other considerations, the humanitarian dimension of this pandemic that the President of Tunisia undertook the initiative to present a draft resolution to UN Security Council. In this vein, it's noteworthy that stopping hostility is not enough. It's our responsibility as well to find durable solutions to many protecting conflicts and disputes, which continue inflicting suffering upon civilians in Palestine territories, in Libya, in Yemen, and in many parts of Africa. It's unfortunate to notice that some parties are exploiting the current situation related to the COVID-19 pandemic to boost the settlement activities and continue violating the rights of Palestinian people. It's our responsibility, Mr. President, to prevent the outbreak of armed conflict, to address their root causes, because hostilities take the lead over preventive diplomacy and before it's too late to save civilians. To conclude, Mr. President, let me underline that ensuring the protection of civilians needs a United Security Council taking up more efficiently its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. It needs from its members to prioritize the global common interest of the international community. It needs from all of us to uphold our commitment to multilateralism and to the Charter of the United Nations. As an elected member, Tunisia will spare no effort during its mandate to contribute to these goals. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I now give the floor to His Excellency Lord Tariq Ahmad of Wimbledon, Minister of State for the Commonwealth, the United Nations and South Asia of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Mr. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am grateful to our briefers, Peter Maurer, Her Excellency Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, and, of course, to Secretary-General Guterres. The stark reality, Your Excellencies, of today's debate is that despite our efforts, our collective efforts, civilians still bear the brunt of conflict. States have the primary responsibility to protect civilians, but too often they and other parties to conflict flout their obligations, and their direct consequences are death, injury, violence against children, torture, and much more. In this year's report, the Secretary-General has again noted the appalling use of sexual and gender-based violence and attacks on places of worship. As the British Prime Minister's Special Representative on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, and also as Minister for Human Rights for the United Kingdom, I can assure you that our commitment to leading global action to tackle these horrific crimes and support all survivors remains solid. It remains steadfast. When the United Nations emerged from the ashes of global conflict 75 years ago, we all collectively resolved to end such horrors. The United Nations has since become the heart of our international system, based on our shared values, our shared rules. Together, we have developed responses to conflict and measures to protect civilians, and we now recognize that our interventions must go beyond physical pain, and that we must protect access to basic services and address psychological harm and indeed family separation. One of the most pivotal steps we have taken together, Your Excellencies, was to establish the Blue Helmets and the Blue Berets and deploy peacekeeping missions and special political missions to conflicts all over the world. To strengthen them further, the United Kingdom continues to support the Secretary-General's Action for Peacekeeping initiative. It is important we deliver the commitments we made in the shared declaration and fully implement Resolution 2436. Accountability is also essential for the United Nations, for our peacekeepers, and indeed for ourselves. It is a fundamental part of providing protection for civilians. The United Kingdom government values the contribution of the International Criminal Court in the fight for justice and unity. By holding perpetrators to account for the most serious of international concern, we shall together shine a spotlight on individual responsibility and deter future atrocities. Our work together at the UN over many decades has furnished us with the necessary tools to stem conflicts. Yet, Your Excellencies, too often, we still hesitate to use them, even when the need is great. Nowhere is that need greater than when we look at the conflicts in Syria, in Yemen, in Myanmar. And protecting civilians in Syria should be a massive priority for all of us. The United Kingdom government continues to urge all parties to the conflict to do just that, and of course to uphold international humanitarian law. More than half the pre-war population are now displaced, and it is unacceptable that the Assad regime continues to prevent aid from reaching millions of people who need it. It is imperative that all parties engage constructively and provide unfettered access to humanitarian organizations. The humanitarian situation in the Northwest remains particularly dire, so it is important that we, the UN Security Council, come together behind UN Security Council Resolution 4 on cross-border aid when it is renewed in July. It is also crucial that we act upon the findings of the UN Board of Inquiry investigation into the appalling attacks in Idlib in 2019 and hold those responsible to account. Protection of civilians is also paramount in Yemen. The ongoing conflict has claimed more than 100,000 lives, and we must all continue to push the parties to the conflict to uphold international humanitarian law and protect human rights. With 80% of the population reliant on humanitarian aid, it is crucial that parties comply with Security Council Resolution 2451 and facilitate the safe, rapid, and unhindered access for humanitarian response. In the long term, the best way to protect Yemen's civilians is a comprehensive political solution to the conflict, and we therefore urge the parties to engage constructively with the peace process led by UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths. And in Myanmar, the recent escalation of the conflict between the military and the Arakan army has led to a spike in civilian casualties, further internal displacement and restrictions on humanitarian access. We urge an immediate cessation of hostilities in Rakhine and Shin for those who commit human rights violations, including against the Rohingya, to be held to account, and the unhindered humanitarian access to protect all communities from the effects of COVID-19. And on COVID-19, the potentially catastrophic impacts of COVID-19 mount on top of the challenges facing civilians living amidst armed conflict. We must now redouble our efforts to protect them, including from those who would seek to use the pandemic to their advantage. Mr. President, when opportunity to end conflict lies before us, let us reach for our tools, not our excuses. Let us get behind the Secretary General's call for a global humanitarian ceasefire. Let all parties to armed conflicts be laying down their weapons at this time and using the space to shield their people from COVID. And let us work collectively to build towards peace. Diplomacy can make that a reality. Together, working together, we could make it a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Niels Annen, Minister of State, German Federal Foreign Office. Mr. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for organizing today's debate, and also thank you to President Kaljulaid for her leadership. 1 year ago, dear colleagues, around this time, I participated in this debate from within the Council chamber. This year, my participation by video link bears testimony on how the world indeed has changed. Yet at the same time, much remains the same. We continue to witness a horrifying number of deaths among civilians in conflict zones. Sexual and gender-based violence persists in many conflicts. We see rampant impunity, and some might say the continued failure of the Security Council to act united and decisively when it matters most. I would like to thank the President of the ICRC, Peter Maurer, and Her Excellency Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf for elaborating so undoubtedly on the situation of civilians in armed conflict. Allow me also to thank the Secretary General for his clear words. We once again endorse his call for a global ceasefire and underline the need for the Security Council to adopt a resolution to this end. We simply cannot wait any longer. Mr. President, there is no doubt COVID-19 has complicated protection efforts across many conflict zones, and what is worse, the pandemic has magnified the vulnerable situation of many, especially women and children. To meet this challenge, safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access remains essential. And that is why it is even more disappointing that in countries like Myanmar, such access is still denied. Unfortunately, the suffering caused by the pandemic has not really changed the policy of regimes all around the world. Germany calls on all to respect international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. And Germany calls on all to show humanity in these challenging times. That is why Germany has responded generously to the global humanitarian response plan by pledging additional 300 million euros in humanitarian aid. And Mr. President, allow me please to make 3 points. First, the Secretary General's report has focused on the accountability gap, and we thank him for doing so. In Syria, for example, parties to the conflict do not uphold their obligations to protect civilians. That is a very polite description on what actually is happening. Because instead of respecting international humanitarian law, they bomb schools and hospitals. The targeting of healthcare facilities in the midst of a pandemic is particularly atrocious and cynical. Similarly, the recent attack in Afghanistan on a maternity ward is particularly heinous. Indiscriminate attacks on civilians are a violation of international humanitarian law and may amount even to war crimes. They must be prosecuted. That is why we strongly support the international criminal justice system with the International Criminal Court at its core. To this end, Germany launched an alliance against impunity to spearhead efforts towards accountability. In particular, we are supportive of various mechanisms to preserve evidence. While successfully prosecution cannot be achieved at this stage, such as because this is the case. And so we are supporting the UN investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh. The International Impartial Independent Mechanism for Syria, the situation has already been mentioned, or the investigative mechanism for Myanmar. If perpetrators are not brought to justice, it will be embolden them and violation will continue. For concrete contribution to the implementation of international humanitarian law and the preservation of humanitarian space, last year Germany and France launched a humanitarian call for action, which has already been endorsed by 45 states from all continents. We will continue promoting and implementing further this initiative, including as part of the French-German cooperation on the occasion of our successful presidencies in the Security Council in June and July. Our successive, of course. As part of, and I hope so will be successful as well. As part of this humanitarian call for action, the German Federal Ministry of Defense has initiated an in-depth study seeking answers to the challenges related to the implementation of protection mandates for peace operations. In this respect, I want to re-emphasize the call of the Group of Friends on Protection of Civilians for an improved operational understanding of protection mandates by troop and policy contributing countries. This meant to ensure an integrated and comprehensive approach to protection tasks in peacekeeping operation as demanded by the Secretary General. Second, we need to consider the efforts of new and emergent technologies. In general, they can add value to our efforts. In peacekeeping, for example, we protect civilians through the use of modern technologies. One example is Germany's contribution to MINUSMA with unmanned aircraft systems for reconnaissance. This system enhances early warning capacity to counter possible threats or attacks against civilians. As with all military systems, of course, new technologies can be applied by either side of the conflict and can therefore also have profound dangerous effects. We have furthermore been particularly concerned by cyber attacks on healthcare facilities during this pandemic. I will be clear. As for Germany, technology, including new and emerging technologies, must be employed in compliance with international humanitarian law and human rights law by both state and non-state actors. Moreover, as today's conflicts are becoming increasingly urbanized, we must strengthen the protection of civilians in urban warfare scenarios, including from humanitarian impacts that can arise from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Germany is actively engaged in the Irish-led process of developing an international political declaration on the issue. And we have introduced an operational approach developed together with the ICRC to enhance respect for existing rules of international humanitarian law through the development and sharing of good military practices. This approach, I believe, has the potential to achieve concrete improvements in the protection of civilians on the ground, including from harm caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, as already mentioned. And Mr. President, third and finally, it is important that we focus on peace and security implementations of the effects of climate change in this debate as well. The Secretary General's report highlights that conflict-affected populations are especially vulnerable to the consequences of climate change. And the report describes severe food crisis and internal displacement as some of the immediate effects. It includes a better understanding of the relationship between conflict and climate change is crucial. We believe it is high time that the Security Council requests and receives an improved information basis regarding the context-specific peace and security implementation of the effects of climate change. We will make sure that best use of our time of the Council together with partners to ensure that climate-related security risks remain on the agenda of the Council. Mr. President, in closing, I assure you that Germany will continue to be a steadfast partner to you, to all members of the Council, to ensure that the protection of civilians remains at the core of our work. And of course, we are delighted to subscribe to the statement made by the European Union and the Group of Friends of the Protection for Civilians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I now give the floor to Niger. Abari, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me first to thank you for giving me the floor and to congratulate you on the choice of this topic, which is particularly important for the international community. I would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate Her Excellency Ms. Kersti Kaljulaid, President of the Republic of Estonia. Mr. President, I would also like to thank the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, as well as His Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Mr. Moura for their statements. As mentioned by OCHA, the protection of civilians in armed conflict has always been the concern of the United Nations and its member states. It is now 2 decades since the Security Council adopted this topic in its agenda, thus officially recognizing it as a matter of international peace and security. Resolution 1265, the Council's first resolution on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, established the parameters of what is today considered as guiding principle on the issue. Mr. President, 2 months have passed since the Secretary General called for a global humanitarian ceasefire in the wake of COVID-19. However, The situation on the ground in many conflict areas is deteriorating at an alarming rate, especially for women, children and elderly, and those with disabilities. In recent weeks, women and babies have been massacred in Afghanistan. Sub-Saharan Africa, for its part, has seen a 37% increase in violence, with dozens of civilians killed in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. Fighting continues in Yemen and Syria, with casualties and displaced persons. In Libya, the already grave situation is in danger of deteriorating further with the overarmament of the protagonists in flagrant violation of the arms embargo imposed by the Security Council itself. In the face of these various tragedies, the members of the Council remain on divergent positions instead of adopting a posture of unity that would have sent a clear message to the various actors committing this violence. Moreover, during those 2 months, armed conflict forced more than 660,000 people around the world to flee violence, making them more vulnerable to infection and further complicating the global fight and recovery effort against the virus. The Sahel and Lake Chad region has seen a sharp increase in the number of internally displaced persons, with Chad and Niger being the most affected. This region is plagued by all kinds of attacks carried out through asymmetric warfare that spares neither the defense and security forces of our countries nor even peacekeepers, let alone civilians. Mr. President, Niger would like to stress that with regard to the protection of civilians in armed conflict, respect for promotion and implementation of international humanitarian law and other applicable legal and political framework by both state and non-state actors are essential. In that regard, I would like to reaffirm Niger's deep commitment to the principles of human rights and its adherence to the international legal instruments for the protection and promotion of those rights as signed and ratified by my country and as promoted by the President of Niger, His Excellency Mr. Issoufou Mahamadou. In armed conflicts, respect for the law of armed conflict is particularly important, especially for the armed forces, which are responsible for ensuring full application in theaters of operation. To this end, and with the aim of integrating these international commitments into the doctrine of its armed forces, Niger, in collaboration with the ICRC, has developed a manual of international humanitarian law for its defense and security forces. In the same vein, Niger fully subscribes to the human rights compliance framework in the context of the G5 Sahel Joint Force, in particular Pillar 4 and 5, relating to the integration of the protection of civilians in the planning and conduct of operations and feedback, RETEX, to assess the impact of operations on the population. Respect for the law of armed conflict cannot be complete unless perpetrators and defenders are held accountable for their actions before the courts. Mr. President, in this time of crisis, we must ensure that the public health response to the pandemic and respect for fundamental legal protections are complementary. This can, as mentioned by the ICRC, by facilitating unhindered humanitarian access for medical personnel and humanitarian workers, the protection of access to food and water, the protection of vulnerable persons and detainees, and access to education for children, especially for young girls. As the current pandemic requires the mobilization of resources, both economic and humanitarian, countries in armed conflict often lack the means to deal with the situation. We would like to echo the Secretary General's statement that it is time to show solidarity, not exclusion. and to call for economic mitigation measures and humanitarian exemptions wherever necessary. Mr. President, to conclude, we should bear in mind that the success of the protection of civilians lies in an inclusive consultative process that is locally owned and engages local communities, as we saw in the recent debate organized by Ireland on the issue of pastoralism in the Sahel. Such people-centered peacekeeping should consider the voices of women, youth, political parties, and civil society. It is only then that lasting solutions could be achieved, since they would be based on a participatory process that would then be accepted and shared by all. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci, Abari. And I now give the floor to Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would first of all like to thank the Secretary General, Her Excellency Sirleaf, and Mr. Moorer for their insightful briefings. I also want to flag that Belgium aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and its member states, as well as with the statement of the Group of Friends of Protection of Civilians, both of which will be submitted to you in writing. The entire world is grappling with the unprecedented challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. But COVID-19 is not the great equalizer. On the contrary, it exacerbates already existing weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our societies. The most vulnerable, already disproportionately impacted by conflicts, often without access to healthcare or humanitarian assistance, now face the devastating consequences of the pandemic. Belgium systematically calls attention to the plight of children who are the invisible victims of COVID-19. Neglecting generations of children in situations of armed conflict is setting those societies up for failure even after the conflict ended. COVID-19 accelerates the vicious circle of violence and instability. Its alarming health, humanitarian and socio-economic impact could aggravate political instability and existing conflicts and thus worsen the protection risks for civilians. Humanitarian and medical workers are attacked and stopped from reaching the most vulnerable. Reports on the increase of hate speech and gender-based violence are also of great concern. The international community must act. The Security Council must assume its responsibility and focus on our strengths as Council. Mr. Secretary General, you have encouraged us to do exactly that by calling for a global ceasefire and humanitarian pause, as well as calling upon governments and other actors to engage closely with UN resident coordinators and humanitarian actors to facilitate the provision of humanitarian assistance, including medical assistance. Belgium fully supports your efforts. In your most recent report on the protection of civilians, you provide us with a sobering account of the lack of compliance with international humanitarian law, the failing protection and the toll these failures take on civilians in most of the countries on the Council's agenda. Mr. Moorer mentioned in his briefing last year the risk of actors using the absence of convergence in the Security Council as a free ride for military operations without limitations and without accountability. The risk is now increasing as parties to conflict might take advantage of situations where the pandemic is absorbing everyone's attention. Mr. President, the fight against impunity for the most serious crimes is a primary responsibility of every state. The fight is one of Belgium's priorities and one of the shared values of the EU, of the European Union. Belgium, as well as the EU, continues to support international justice and accountability mechanisms, including the work and independence of the International Criminal Court, and urges all UN members to do the same. We call upon states to facilitate the development of mutual legal assistance in order to investigate and prosecute these crimes, including by facilitating the extradition of suspects. At the 33rd International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, Belgium pledged with the EU member states and Red Cross national societies to strengthen the implementation and dissemination of international humanitarian law. To do this, Training is key. We commend the Department of Peace Operations and co-authors on its new POC handbook, representing a valuable practical guide for all peacekeepers. We also hope this POC handbook, outlining very clear the whole range of armed as well as unarmed civilian protection strategies, can provide a good basis for further reflection on integrating POC in future more lightweight or agile peace operations. Indeed, peace operations will need to become more structured in their approach to protecting civilians during transitions and changes in United Nations presence. UN special political missions can also play an important role in protecting civilians. Dissemination of international humanitarian law and protection of civilians is impossible without engaging with non-state armed groups, as only through dialogue can information be shared, compliance encouraged, and humanitarian access negotiated. This means making sure that counterterrorism measures do not hinder this engagement and thus do not impede principled humanitarian action. Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Moorer, we commend the increased attentions in the POC report as well as in reports of ICRC for the particular vulnerability of conflict-affected populations to the consequences of climate change. Indeed, the world's 8 worst food crises are all linked to both conflict and climate shocks, and therefore it's our responsibility as Security Council to gain a better understanding of these linkages. Lastly, Mr. Secretary General, a crisis of this scale calls for clear leadership. Just like the nations of the world look to the WHO for guidance in fighting the pandemic, they look to the UN to galvanize international solidarity. As a member of the Council, Belgium stands behind you and supports your effort to ensure the protection of civilians, especially in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci beaucoup. I now give the floor to the United States. Kelly, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sven, and thank you to the Secretary General, Mr. Maher, and President Sirleaf for your informative presentations today. This annual briefing is especially timely in the context of COVID-19. As the Secretary General's Protection of Civilian report stated, the pandemic has the potential to devastate conflict-affected countries and overwhelm already weak healthcare systems. It will continue to exacerbate vulnerabilities for women and girls, refugees, displaced persons, older persons, making conflict mediation more challenging. The United States already provided over $1 billion in health and humanitarian aid to combat COVID-19. Our foreign assistance is saving lives and helping address economic devastation of the world. Consistent with the U.S. strategy on women, peace, and security, we are working to ensure our assistance includes local strategies to mitigate COVID-19's acute risk to women and girls, including conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. The United States strongly believes that all parties to conflict must comply with international humanitarian law and international humanitarian rights law. Promoting and training and sensitization to these laws consistent with the UN's human rights due diligence policy as applicable will be critical. The United States has shared and built upon best practices, including bilaterally and during coalition operations. We encourage others to do the same. Globally, attacks on civilians are all too common. For instance, the Secretary General's UNAMA report notes that anti-government elements were responsible for the majority of civilian deaths. In Burma, the UN fact-finding mission documented the security forces' long-standing practice of attacking civilians from ethnic and religious minority groups. In Syria, the Assad regime and its military allies, Russia and Iran, continue to put civilians at risk by using barrel bombs and improvised rocket-assisted munitions. These have killed countless children. We applaud the efforts of international, impartial, and independent mechanism which is collecting and preserving evidence of crimes committed in the country, and the Board of Inquiry, which recently investigated perpetrators of attacks on civilian infrastructure. In line with Security Council Resolution 2254, we call for the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in Syria, political and peace process. Protecting civilians in armed conflict is a collective effort. We support the Secretaries General call for a global ceasefire to enable health officials to address COVID-19 and for unhindered, safe access for human rights and humanitarian workers. It is critical that humanitarians, healthcare personnel, and supplies are ensured access to all people in order to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance. Civil society, including journalists and human rights defenders, plays an important role investigating violations and abuses. The Council must help to protect these individuals from reprisals. Member states must also address violations and abuses of international humanitarian and human rights law through relevant national, regional, and international legal mechanisms. The United States supports the Secretary General's call for national protection frameworks to strengthen respect for international humanitarian law and promote monitoring and reporting mechanisms. Leveraging technology for more robust crisis mapping and data analysis will be needed to establish early warning systems. Likewise, we support the Department of Peace Operations' revised protection of civilians policy. Peacekeeping creates the space for political and peace processes to take shape, enabling host states to find durable solutions to the armed conflicts. In the DRC, the UN Security Council has adapted MONUSCO's mandate to meet the difficult challenge of protecting civilians in the eastern part of the country. The new mandate enhanced and clarified the role of the Force Invention Brigade, addressing the concerns of Congolese civilians who wanted a more immediate response by attacks by armed groups. This Council's willingness to adapt and refine mandates to meet the needs of the ground helps to ensure the missions are fit for the purpose. To better protect civilians in conflict, the United States and 46 member states have endorsed the Kaljulaid principles. We encourage all member states to join us so that we can help peacekeepers effectively implement their protection to civilian mandates. While we know that COVID-19 has restricted movement and troop rotations, it's important that peace operations continue to fulfill their protection of civilian mandates while ensuring the safety, security, and health of all UN personnel. The United States believes that efforts to protect civilians and peace cannot be achieved without the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women. Peace is more durable when women are at the table for peace talks. Additionally, increasing women's meaningful participation in peacekeeping improves operational effectiveness and a mission's ability to fulfill protection of civilian mandates. Today's VTC is an opportunity to discuss how, collectively, we can better protect civilians in conflict. This Council cannot accept attacks on children, infrastructure, and civilians as normal. Especially amid the COVID-19 pandemic, we are compelled to demonstrate the political will to promote implementation of protection framework and pursue accountability for violations of international law. The United States will continue to seek mechanisms to better protect civilians from barbaric acts, the acts that the United Nations was created to prevent. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I now give the floor to South Africa. Jerry, please.
Mr. President, it has been an honor to have the President of Estonia addressing our Council today. We also benefited from the address from the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the ministers from Indonesia, Tunisia, United Kingdom, and Germany. We also wish to thank Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, for his annual report on the protection of civilians, which underpins our discussions today. I wish to further to thank Mr. Peter Mora, President of ICRC, and Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, former President of Liberia, for the opportunity for us to benefit from their knowledge and vast experience in the field of protection of civilians. Mr. President, our discussions on the protection of civilians is taking place at a time when we are all faced with arguably the biggest global challenge to the end of the Second World War. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted all of us, irrespective of our level of development and whether we are experiencing conflict or not. However, countries in conflicts will require additional support to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the population, in particular, internally displaced persons, refugees who will be in dire need of humanitarian assistance. Armed conflicts continue to have a devastating impact on civilians, with millions being forced from their homes, thousands killed or injured. Children are growing up knowing nothing else but war, while women and girls continue to be subjected to sexual and gender-based violence and other forms of violations. Access to humanitarian assistance is being compromised with the destruction of hospitals, attack on medical transport and essential services, as well as the military use of medical facilities and schools have become commonplace in countries experiencing violence and conflicts. It is important, Mr. President, that the protection of civilian facilities maintain their civilian character and are not misused by parties to a conflict. The advent of COVID-19 pandemic is further compounding the efforts aimed at protecting civilians. In this regard, South Africa wishes to reiterate its full support for the call of Secretary General for a global ceasefire in order to focus on the fight against COVID-19 pandemic. The Charter of the United Nations, which adopted 25 years ago, mandates the Security Council to maintain international peace and security. If innocent children, women and men continue to suffer on our watch, and the Council fails to take meaningful action, we'll be failing in the responsibility entrusted to us by the Charter of the United Nations. It is regrettable that the plight of civilians in protracted conflict situations such as Palestine and Western Sahara seems to not receive adequate attention, and that accountability for violations against these people in these territories are lacking. Mr. President, protection of civilians during armed conflict is a cornerstone of international humanitarian law, where it underlines that the primary responsibility of state is to protect civilians within their borders. In this regard, we reiterate our call on all parties to the armed conflict, state and non-state actors, to comply with the obligation applicable to them under international humanitarian law and to take required steps to protect civilians. In order to deter the threats to civilians and foster greater compliance with international humanitarian law, we believe that the necessary accountability mechanism at national level are essential. Broader regional and international mechanisms should continue to support these based on the principles of complementarity and subsidiarity. The United Nations peacekeeping is one of the most recognized mechanisms for the protection of civilians. Peacekeeping operations, whatever their mandate, are essential to ensure the protection of civilians. However, it is also important to recognize the changing environment in which peacekeepers currently operate and the emerging threat to international peace and security. in order to execute the protection of civilian mandate. Mr. President, needless to say, we should ensure that the protection of civilians' mandate is adequately funded. If this council is going to issue mandates to protect civilians, we have to provide the necessary resources to those executing the mandates we give. Finally, Mr. President, greater coordination and cooperation between the UN and regional organizations such as the African Union, which continues to develop its framework on the protection of civilians for its own peace and security operations, is necessary to create an enabling environment for protection of civilians. The competitive advantage of regional organizations can enable closer collaboration and coordination with local communities, including creating the necessary environment for the return of refugees and internally displaced persons on a voluntary basis and in accordance with the principles of non-refoulement. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Jerry. And now I give the floor to Vietnam. Quy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Estonian presidency for convening this timely debate. I am grateful for the statement by Secretary General and other briefers. We know with serious concern the continued suffering of civilians in armed conflict in 2019, with more than 20,000 civilians killed or injured in 10 countries. Civilians continue to account for the vast majority of deaths and injuries in armed conflict. Women and children remain targets of violence and abuse, accounting for 22% of the casualties and injured. Millions of people remain displaced, facing the increased risks of starvation and fatal contagion. Mr. President, the protection of civilians in armed conflict has been an arduous task of the international community and for the Security Council. Last year, the Security Council marked the 20th anniversary of the protection of civilians on its agenda. It was highlighted that the Council actions had undoubtedly saved civilian lives. Yes, much more needed to be done. 1 year later, we are saddened to hear that the reality on the ground tells a vastly different story. It is high time we redouble our efforts and transform our political will and commitment into action. In this regard, I would like to make the following observation. We continue to stress the paramount importance of conflict prevention and peace building. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Addressing the root cause of conflict and ensuring equity, justice, and development is the best way to prevent conflict from happening and recurring. We support full and meaningful participation of women in conflict prevention and sustaining peace. Regional organizations should play a leading role in promoting preventive diplomacy and confidence-building measures. And in this regard, we are proud to share that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has been made great contribution in turning Southeast Asia into a region of friendship and cooperation. When an armed conflict breaks out, it is the primary responsibility of states to protect their own citizens. States should not start this responsibility from scratch. We support enhancing national ownership of these issues, including through strengthening awareness of national entities regarding their obligation under international humanitarian law and building national capacity. United Nations peacekeeping operation, while abiding by the principles of peacekeeping, can assist in certain cases. It is essential that they be given a clear protection of civilian mandate and adequately resourced and trained to meet the mandate's expectation. Enhancing and ensuring respect for international law, including international humanitarian law, by all parties to armed conflict is crucial, especially principle of distinction, necessity, and proportionality. We strongly condemn attacks against civilian and civilian objects. Those violations must be addressed appropriately at national and international level in accordance with the applicable law and the UN Charter. It is extremely distressing to hear reports on the attack against healthcare facilities and schools. Other infrastructure critical to survival of civilian community should also be protected, such as relating to water and food security system. With increased urban warfare, extra care should be given to ensuring the well-being of innocent civilians in densely populated areas. It is imperative that all civilians have access to assistance. We call on all parties to armed conflict to ensure unhindered access to humanitarian agency and that operate in accordance with the guiding principle of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, the COVID-19 pandemic doubled the vulnerability of civilians in the conflict situation. Access to and supplies of necessary assistance should take precedence. We reiterate our support for the Secretary General's call for a global humanitarian ceasefire to allow adequate response to COVID-19. All parties should join forces to fight this common enemy. Make every effort to plan and implement concrete and meaningful steps to peace and recovery. As a country that has experienced firsthand and suffering of the people, we fully empathize with the plight and of civilians in armed conflict around the world. Protection of civilians will continue to be among top priority for Vietnam on the Security Council and beyond. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Quy. I now give the floor to China. June, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, China highly commends the initiative of convening this open debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. We welcome President Kaljulaid to attend the meeting and thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing. We also welcome the participation of President Moro and Ms. Sirleaf. Mr. President, the international community, including the Security Council, has made tremendous efforts to protect the civilians in armed conflict. This Council has adopted a number of resolutions and presidential statements in this regard. Nevertheless, our work still faces multiple challenges, compounded by evolving situations of conflicts and new risks, including COVID-19 pandemic. Civilians bear the brunt of wars and armed conflicts, accounting for the vast majority of casualties. The latest Secretary General report presented a bleak picture of continued civilian sufferings in armed conflicts. In 2019, the United Nations reported more than 20,000 civilians killed and injured as a result of attacks in 10 conflicts and millions of civilians displaced. China strongly believes the paramount importance of protecting civilians in armed conflict can never be overemphasized. We therefore support for in-depth discussions and concrete actions of the Council on this issue. Firstly, we must address the root causes of conflicts and promote development for peace. This is the best approach to protect the civilians. In many cases, absolute poverty and hunger induce violence and conflicts, which in turn undermine development and worsen poverty and food insecurity. Only by addressing the root causes can we break this vicious cycle. Sustainable and inclusive development is key for achieving long-term stability and sustaining peace. The 2030 Agenda must be effectively implemented, with poverty eradication as the first priority. It's time for action. China firmly supports Secretary General's Decade of Action initiative and calls on the international community to jointly pursue this innovative, coordinated, green, open, and shared development. Secondly, the Security Council should tirelessly prevent and peacefully resolve conflicts through political dialogue, mediation, and negotiation. Preventing conflicts, reducing and resolving them by peaceful means are the most effective way to protect the civilians. At present, armed conflicts continue in some areas, resulting in a high number of civilian casualties. We urge all parties concerned to respond positively to the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire and move toward political settlement through inclusive dialogue. The fundamental principles of international law, such as peaceful settlement of disputes and the prohibition of the threat or use of force, must be upheld. Many of the prolonged conflicts are aftermath of violation to UN Charter and other basic international law. For example, the people of Syria and Iraq have endured years of sufferings caused by the use of force unauthorized by the Security Council. This should not happen again. Thirdly, all parties to the conflict must fulfill their obligations of protecting civilians under international law. The Geneva Convention, international humanitarian law, and the relevant Security Council resolutions, in particular Resolution 1265, and other resolutions concerning medical personnel, women, children, and missing persons, must be fully implemented. We urge all parties to the conflicts to refrain from asymmetric use of force in densely populated areas. There should be zero tolerance of harming civilians. It's also critical for all parties to give special attention and care to vulnerable groups, in particular women and children, and facilitate safe and unimpeded humanitarian access. COVID-19 pandemic brings further risk to civilians in armed conflict. All parties should prioritize the interests of the people and take proactive measures to combat the virus. Unilateral sanctions severely undermine the capacity of vulnerable countries to respond to the pandemic, aggravating civilian sufferings. We call on relevant countries to lift the unilateral sanctions immediately and join these global efforts of combating the virus, including by supporting the leading role of WHO. China has provided medical assistance and sent medical teams to countries in armed conflict, helping them to fight against COVID-19. At the recently held World Health Organization Assembly, President Xi Jinping has announced 5 significant measures to boost the international cooperation against the pandemic. We will continue to deliver support for countries in need. Fourthly, national governments must bear the primary responsibility to protect their civilians. UN peacekeeping operations should work closely with governments and follow strictly their mandate when fulfilling the responsibility to protect the civilians. UN agencies and other humanitarian institutions need to engage actively with governments of countries concerned and respect their sovereignty so as to develop trust and facilitate humanitarian operations. The guiding principles of humanitarian emergency assistance, as set out in GA Resolution 46182, must be respected and upheld. The SRC has set up a role model in this regard. Any violation of international humanitarian law, such as threats or attacks against the civilians in armed conflict, should be investigated and punished in accordance with the law. Meanwhile, the international community should respect the national judicial system of countries concerned and not impose external measures. We should bear in mind that foreign occupation and interference, terrorist activities, unilateral sanctions, and many other factors also cause sufferings of civilians, which must be held accountable without impunity. The protection of civilians should not be politicized or used as an excuse for interference in internal affairs. Even regime change, those who invoke international law must submit themselves to it. The Security Council should adopt a consistent position in all situations on its agenda. Double standards or selective approach will only damage the authority of the Council. Mr. President, a human life is of greater value than anything else. We must take a people-centered approach in dealing with any issue on the agenda of the Security Council. It's the moral obligation of the international community to do whatever we can to take pragmatic and effective measures to ensure the safety and the dignity of civilians in armed conflicts. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Jun, and I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Ambassador. Many thanks to the Secretary General, Mr. Peter Maurer and Madam Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf for their contributions to today's meeting. Indeed, the work of the Security Council over these years has helped to strengthen the protection of civilians, thereby saving lives. Unfortunately, despite all our efforts, thousands of civilians, especially women, children, elderly, and the persons with disabilities continue to suffer. To our great regret, an unprecedented politicization of the humanitarian issues in international relations still dominates. Now the plight of civilians becomes even harder. The threats and challenges they are facing are multiplied due to the unprecedented global health crisis, COVID-19, which indeed leaves no one behind. It is high time to unite our efforts to achieve the noble goals of protecting people and minimizing their suffering. In this regard, we find highly relevant the Secretary's General appeal for global ceasefire on March 23, 2020. But this call will be incomplete without a reference to his appeal to waive sanctions, which can undermine countries' capacity to respond to the pandemic. The same appeal was expressed by High Commissioner on Human Rights, who stressed that in a context of global pandemic, the policy of impeding medical efforts in one country heightens the risk for all of us. We agree, protecting healthcare workers, facilitating access of humanitarian assistance are important in the fight against COVID-19. But it will not be effective if there is no access to essential healthcare services and quality, safe, effective, and affordable essential medicines, vaccines, personal protection, and food items. International cooperation and solidarity might not be inclusive and exhaustive, while unilateral sanctions remain in effect. Let me refer to the situation in Syria, where suffocating sanctions hit ordinary Syrians, including by preventing authorities from purchasing necessary medical equipment, intimidating international humanitarian NGOs who are affected by fear of being sanctioned. Yes, I refer to civilians, women, children, about whom many of my colleagues so such like to speak within the Council, about civilians who suffer most from coercive measures of your countries. Coercive measures can be even more shameful when they are used by government against their own people I'm referring to Ukraine now. Kiev continued to pursue its brutally repressive policy towards Donetsk and Lugansk, which already negatively affected more than 5 million civilians residents of this conflict area, deprived hundreds of thousands of pensioners to access their pensions, prevented access to education and health services. Again, our Western colleagues prefer not to pay attention and shift responsibility. Mr. President, armed conflicts in various parts of the world remain a reality. Through their nature has changed by new threats and potential dangers, such as increased terrorist groups' activity, who use modern communication technologies and spreading practice of using combat drones. To answer the problem is a full respect for international law. First of all, international humanitarian law. We concur with the Secretary General about the importance of safeguarding the authority of IHL. The norms of international humanitarian law should not be used for political manipulations. There is no need to develop new international legal concepts that allegedly fill so-called gaps in the protection regimes. In practice, such ideas can only weaken the protection we give civilians. We are convinced that implementation problems lie not in the weakness of international humanitarian law, but in the disinclination or reluctance to implement its principles and norms in practice. Mr. President, I would like to also touch upon the issue of accountability. Nobody argues the importance of measures to bring to justice those responsible for the most heinous crimes. However, we can neither share positive assessments of the work of the International Criminal Court, nor support the call for increased cooperation with it. We have expressed in detail our position on the activities of the ICC on many occasions. Since then, unfortunately, nothing has changed. The ICC proved to be the wrong instrument to fight the most severe crimes under international humanitarian law. We have repeatedly said that for the civilized level of criminal prosecution, NGO reports alone and information from other reliable, so-called reliable, but never tell anybody sources are not enough. Numerous international investigations mechanisms work on the very same principle, sometimes without even entering the country of the crime scene. And just a mockery of justice when such imposed, contrary to the will of the affected state, information gathering structures are created through an illegitimate decision and therefore are themselves illegitimate. I'm talking first of all about the so-called independent mechanism to assist in the investigation of crimes in Syria, IIIM, and similar initiatives. Mr. President, I would like to finish my recalling the words of the Secretary General that COVID-19 pandemic, the greatest test the world has faced since the formation of the United Nations, which severely impacts the protection of civilians. To pass this test, we Security Council members are to put aside differences, egoism, messianism, and the temptation to pursue interest to the detriment of others and work together to ensure peace and security for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I give the to the Dominican Republic. Jose, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Secretary General and Madame Johnson for their briefings as we explore concrete ways to address the pressing challenges that remain and the new that emerge for the protection of civilians in armed conflict. We also thank President Peter Maurer and, through him, the men and women who tirelessly work as promoters of the principles enshrined in the Geneva Convention to protect the life and dignity of civilians in armed conflict. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, in his report, the Secretary General referred to the current COVID-19 pandemic as the greatest test that the world has faced since the establishment of the United Nations. It is clear for the Dominican Republic that this pandemic has brought to the surface many underlying and systemic vulnerabilities, particularly in countries affected by armed conflict, where the absence of timely and adequate actions to address the root causes of these conflicts puts greater challenges for the prevention and response measures required to protect the most vulnerable. But it is also another layer that adds to the suffering of civilians already paying the highest price in so many contexts. The elderly, people living with disabilities, men, children, and women living with other underlying diseases, the displaced, the refugees, those living in overcrowded IDP camps, those in detention centers, all need to be protected in dignity, in justice, in solidarity with the respect for their fundamental rights. Due to the severe impact of the pandemic in conflict-affected countries, we continue to call for sustainable and long-lasting ceasefires in current situations and armed conflict. Attacks on health care and humanitarian workers, hospitals, schools, and the use of explosive weapons in highly civilian-populated areas are gross violations to IHL that clearly undermine the prevention and response efforts to the pandemic. The emergence of atrocious methods of warfare, such as the use of starvation of civilians and the unlawful denial of humanitarian access to the affected populations, are just a few violations that require our urgent attention and actions. Violations to IHL should not be the norm. They should be the exception. We agree that the respect for international law and accountability for serious violations are the two most important, most pressing challenges to strengthening the protection of civilians. Without concrete actions in these areas, little will be able to advance in the construction of a protections culture all across the UN system. Parties to conflict, humanitarian organizations, UN peacekeeping and political missions, national armed forces, etc. To strengthen the protection of civilians in armed conflict, this is our collective responsibility. Mr. President, in recent years, and despite the calls of international organizations and member states, urban warfare continues to have a devastating impact on civilians and critical civilian infrastructure. We join others in reiterating that parties to conflict need to refrain immediately from using urban settings as battlefields. It provokes massive displacements and increase and disproportionate impact on women and children. Allow me to highlight some additional points that require our decisive attention when considering this critical issue. There is mounting evidence that conflict-affected populations are especially vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. At the same time, climate change acts as a risk multiplier when competition for scarce resources becomes root for conflicts and violence between communities. For instance, the combination of conflict, extreme weather events, economic shocks, and natural disasters are the major factors for food insecurity and mass displacements. Therefore, a better and holistic understanding of how these factors interact and the possible actions to strengthen the protection of those affected by them is absolutely crucial for the Dominican Republic. The protection of civilians is not a one-size-fits-all issue. The UN system as a whole, including its peacekeeping and political missions, need to be equipped to address the particular protection needs of the populations they serve particularly and most importantly in armed conflict. I thank you.
Thank you, Jose. And now I give the floor to the last speaker on the list, France. Nicolas, tu as la parole.
Mr. President, I thank Estonia for this debate and welcome the participation of the President of Estonia. I would also like to thank the Secretary General for his report, the President of the ICRC, Peter Maurer, and the former President, Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, for their interventions. Civilians are the target of unacceptable violence, from Afghanistan to Libya, from South Sudan, Mali, Central African Republic, the DRC, Yemen to Iraq. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed or injured, and millions forcefully displaced. COVID-19 has exacerbated the vulnerability of those most vulnerable in conflict zones, in particular refugees and displaced persons. Together with Tunisia, we will continue our efforts within the UN Security Council to support the SG's call for a cessation of hostilities to facilitate the fight against the pandemic. This council has developed tools to address protections of civilians in a more systematic and effective manner. First, the Security Council has repeatedly condemned violations committed by all parties. We regret that the Council has not been able to condemn violation of international humanitarian law and humanitarian law taking place in Myanmar or in Syria. It's absolutely necessary that the Security Council renew the cross-border mechanism that populations in need, including in the Northeast, be able to receive aid through the most effective and direct routes. Second, the UN Security Council has mandated peacekeeping operations to protect civilians. They are carrying their mandate in a more robust and innovative manner. MINUSCA has developed 3 search teams composed of both police and civilian personnel specialized in protection of civilians that can be deployed in hotspots. MINUSMA has set up temporary bases close to the population to strengthen social cohesion. Protection of civilians have become key when assessing the performance of UN missions. Unfortunately, women and girls continue to be subject to appalling sexual and gender-based violence, and children to be recruited by armed groups. It is paramount that the United Nations missions be given sufficient capacity and human resources to respond to their specific needs. I will now turn to 4 challenges. First, the issue of attacks on humanitarian and medical personnel is particularly worrying in the context of COVID-19. Parties to armed conflicts must respect their obligation under international humanitarian law to protect humanitarian and medical personnel and units and to ensure humanitarian access. The humanitarian call for action presented by France and Germany last September addresses this issue through different concrete engagements. France is planning to launch a national plan of action aiming at strengthening international humanitarian law training of state and non-state actors. We encourage all member states to endorse the humanitarian call and welcome the endorsements of the call by Chile and the Maldives, bringing the number of signatories to 45. Second, the question of the use of weapons, which is addressed in the SG's report. Much of the harm and destruction in current conflicts appears to be the result of violations of international humanitarian law provisions, including, but not limited to, the indiscriminate and disproportionate use of explosive weapons in populated areas. France is engaged in the ongoing negotiations toward the development of a political declaration to improve the protection of civilians. To that end, this political declaration must address the issue of the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons, but it shall not stigmatize explosive weapons themselves. It must affirm that the core challenge is to improve the implementation of international humanitarian principles by promoting appropriate policies and practices for the conduct of military operations in urban contexts and by encouraging states to exchange good practices. France is also engaged in efforts to address the possible challenges associated with the development of lethal weapon systems featuring autonomy. Substantial progress has been made through the work of the dedicated governmental experts. This includes the adoption of 11 guiding principles, reaffirming that international humanitarian law continues to apply fully to all weapon systems. Third, the protection of journalists in armed conflict has to become effective. We commend the 4 groups of friends on protection of journalists and their efforts to support implementation of relevant Security Council resolution. Finally, we must redouble our efforts to support justice for victims. The arrest in France of Félicien Kabuga, one of the high-profile remaining fugitives indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda 2 weeks ago, is a reminder that those responsible for mass atrocities can be brought to justice. France will also continue to support fight against impunity of perpetrators of atrocities committed in Syria through national proceeding and support to the Commission of Inquiry and the IIIM. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci, Nicolas. And now there are no more speakers inscribed on the list of speakers, and so the meeting is adjourned.